The crucial period through the turn of the 4th century and into the 5th would see the further rapid weakening of the Roman Empire. Unrelenting pressure from barbarian tribes, weak leadership, internal infighting, and economic woes would see Rome move even closer to the point of collapse. Unable to defeat many of her enemies militarily, this period would see the rollout of the Foederati approach, whereby barbarian groups were given rights and status within the empire, settling within her borders and ultimately posing a huge risk in time. The city of Rome itself too would be sacked, in an event not seen in over 800 years, a symbol of the flames which would soon engulf the entirety of the Western Empire. Theodosius would inherit rule in 379 AD with the death of Emperor Valens, who was killed while fighting the Tervingi Goths at the Battle of Adrianople. Alongside Valens' death, up to 2/3 of the Eastern army were also wiped out in the devastating encounter. It was a slaughter that sent shockwaves around the empire. New Emperor Theodosius would be almost immediately thrown into the fire when he was forced to meet the same Gothic forces led by their chieftain, Fritigern. Here, at the Battle of Thessalonica in 380 AD, Theodosius faced off against enemy Gothic forces, possibly as a result of a hastily reconstituted Eastern army following its near wipeout the year previously. Rome was again defeated. As a result of this series of defeats and the weak current state of his forces, Emperor Theodosius quickly sought peace with the Goths. They were allowed to settle within the empire with autonomous status. This encroachment was a trend which would only increase as rulers were faced with little choice but to seek arrangement with some of the tribal invaders. Alongside this peace deal, he also wrapped up the Sasanian conflict in the east with a partition agreed. This brought to a close centuries of conflict with these fearsome Persian horsemen and served to bring Rome further breathing space in the short term. Alongside these pragmatic yet ultimately strategically problematic peace arrangements, Theodosius also looks to further cement the place of Christianity early on in his reign. Building on the work of Constantine and his Council of Nicaea, Theodosius quickly issued the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD, which confirmed Nicene Christianity as orthodoxy. It also further outlawed Arianism, another Christian sect of the time, branding it as heresy. This further ingrained the practice of rulings from a state-sponsored church against sects with less power. Whilst pagan practices still persisted during this period, Theodosius's actions helped ensure their days were numbered. His declaration of Christianity as official state religion went further than even Constantine the Great in regards to faith. During his reign, he faced key threats from two usurpers in 388 and 394 AD, both of whom tried to lay claim to the western portion of the empire. The first of the contenders, Magnus Maximus, was defeated resoundingly at the Battle of Poetovio in 388 AD, where, despite valiant fighting by his infantry, Maximus's forces were ultimately overwhelmed. He fled to a nearby garrison but was handed over to Theodosius's forces and subsequently executed along with his son. Also notably central to the battle was King Alaric and his Gothic auxiliary forces fighting alongside Roman troops. They were, in fact, thrust to the front of the attack by Theodosius and sent forward in human waves and suffering great losses as a result, something Alaric and the Goths would not forget quickly. While the victory against Maximus gave Theodosius sole rule over the Eastern and Western Empire, the constant pivoting from barbarian threats to dealing with internal Roman threats in battle was a big drain on resources and manpower. The military demands of this period were so severe that they resulted in increasingly unsustainable taxes being imposed on the Roman populace, in particular, the raising of the Annona Militaris tax. As the cost of maintaining a functioning military and defending the empire spiraled, tax rates were hiked in response. This created a vicious cycle where the poor, and often farmers, were increasingly forced out of their professions, leaving their land, and in turn reducing Rome's ability to feed itself. When further combined with demographic decline of the empire during the period and the dilution of Roman society and civic principles with the increasing influx of barbarian tribes, both as Foederati and invaders, meant increasingly severe problems for the Roman administrative machine. Along with these challenges, the empire also struggled during the period with increased corruption levels amongst officials, as well as wayward governors ruling with increasing impunity outside the control of Rome. This could partly have been a result of the general sense of decline in the empire. The obvious weakening of imperial structures, presence of increasing barbarian numbers, and economic decline helping to create a situation where the rules held less fast, and making quick gains, even through corrupt means, became more permissible. An example of this from the period is the governor Rufinus. He was a statesman and praetorian prefect of the Eastern Empire during Theodosius's reign. A greatly influential figure, he held almost unaccountable power. Unsurprisingly, corruption accompanied this. He was renowned for his embezzlement and corrupt practices, illegally seizing the assets of others and taking bribes. A great rivalry would develop between himself and General Stilicho of the West, possibly partly on account of these practices. However, actions by figures such as Rufinus only served to further weaken the authority of the empire and alienate tax-paying citizens. In 395 AD, upon Theodosius' death, his son Arcadian inherited rule of the Eastern Empire, while his younger brother Honorius assumed role over the West. Aged just 18 and 10 respectively, they did not have much accumulated experience and, as a result, were ripe for manipulation and control by factions within the Roman court. They were immediately thrust into crisis in 395 AD upon accession, with the revolt of Alaric the Goth, an ominous forewarning of things to come. Alaric was a respected leader amongst the Goth tribes and the first king of the Visigoths. As was increasingly common in this late stage of the empire, Alaric had collaborated and fought alongside Rome extensively in the years prior, serving in Theodosius's campaign to put down the usurper Eugenius. As such, he knew Roman battle tactics intimately, as well as the general state of society and the military. This may have been part of the reason he chose this time to mount his rebellion, as the two new young and inexperienced co-rulers had just assumed power. Alaric's group were also classed as Foederati, who had previously been granted rights and autonomy within the empire's borders, a demonstration of the dangers posed by this semi-integration of potentially hostile adversary groups. They were a proficient fighting force, and while less capable at holding formations during the heat of battle, Alaric's men were a strong match for Rome's depleted capabilities at this time. They were dominated by heavy infantry armed with medium-length swords known as the spatha. With largely only nobles being able to afford full protection, most Goth troops were poorly armored in comparison to Roman forces, though they did also have a heavily armored cavalry contingent armed with lance and sword, which could add weight to their charges and occupy the Roman cavalry during battle. Illustrating the globalized and connected nature of the Roman world at this time, Alaric's Gothic forces also often had a Sarmatian-mounted archer contingent which were recruited as auxiliaries from their territory in modern-day Iran. The Goths embarked on a grand campaign from 395 AD, moving initially towards Constantinople and audaciously besieging it for a period before reaching agreement with the ruler and moving west. In 396 AD, they proceeded to pillage their way through the Adriatic and Greece, including the cities of Athens and Sparta. These weren't just costly maneuvers for Rome, but also extremely humiliating. to see marauding barbarians almost unchallenged travel from province to province, with the empire unable to defend her citizens. Alaric's first rebellion only died down when defeated in battle by powerful Roman general Stilicho and his army outside Corinth, something which had taken more than a year. Stilicho, though, possibly with an eye to the future and self-preservation, chose to let the Gothic enemy escape without destroying them. This would ensure Alaric and his army could pose a threat again in the future. The respite was brief, though, for the brothers Arcadian and Honorius. King Alaric renewed his campaign in late 401 AD, this time mounting a campaign into Italy itself, showing the proximity to the heart of the empire these tribes could now operate. Gone were the days of Emperor Aurelius and the ability of Rome to confront these enemies far from the gates of Rome in the forests of Germania. Alaric's forces crossed the Italian Alps just after General Stilicho had departed north with his armies to try and confront the Vandal threat. This gave Alaric near clear passage, and his men spent time raiding northern Italy before moving towards Milan, where Emperor Honorius was based. He quickly fled to the modern-day town of Asti and was besieged by Goth forces there. Due to the now winter conditions, Stilicho was not able to cross back over the Alps into Italy to provide relief, so Honorius had to wait until the next march for this relief. Two battles then followed between Stilicho and Alaric's forces at Paulentina and Verona in April and June of 402 AD. At Verona, Alaric's forces became encircled by Stilicho's army in the mountain passes, suffering heavy losses. It would have been possible to completely wipe out or capture the remaining Goth troops, including Alaric himself. However, they were allowed to retreat back into their Balkan territory. This was in part due to the general's ongoing feud with Arcadian in Constantinople and his unwillingness to lose a potential future ally in Alaric in a fight against the Eastern Empire. Alaric did agree to come to terms with Honorius, though, pledging his allegiance once more, at least for a few years. Incursions continued into the homeland of Italy through 405 and 406, with the most significant led by Goth king Radagaisus. Traveling with around 20,000 men and many non-combatants, it was part migration, part invasion. As with other barbarian groups from the region, they were feeling the pressure of the Huns to the east, which was a key factor pushing these migrations west into Roman territory. Nonetheless, Radagaisus posed a serious threat to the Western Empire. Moving from the plains of Hungary, his troops had near free reign of northern Italy for months, as with Alaric before him. General Stilicho finally moved to meet Radagaisus' forces in August of 406 AD. He likely fielded around 15,000 troops, which included a number of Hun and Alan auxiliaries. The main battle occurred just outside of Florence, where the main Goth force was besieging the city. Following an initial skirmish, which successfully removed a contingent of Radagaisus' auxiliary troops, Stilicho's force was now greater in numbers. With this advantage, he was able to encircle the Goth forces, creating a second siege of sorts. It was a brutal tactic, as the increasingly desperate Goth forces tried and failed repeatedly to break out. With famine soon emerging among his men, Radagaisus sought terms with Stilicho. He had likely been promised safe passage at a minimum, but Stilicho immediately went back on the deal and had him beheaded. Many of his elite troops were subsequently recruited into the Roman army, with the remainder taken into slavery. Reportedly, it was in such high numbers, it temporarily crashed the slave market due to the influx of supply. Victory over Radagaisus was a cause for celebration and boost to the otherwise quite depleted morale of the Western Empire after years of blows. However, it was again nothing more than a temporary reprieve, as Stilicho, in moving to face the Goths besieging Florence, had drawn from the troops on the frontier, leaving that area exposed. This, combined with an extremely cold winter of 405 to 406 AD, which froze over great areas of the Rhine, allowed much easier passage into Roman territory, which groups of Alans and Vandals would immediately take advantage of. Stretched Roman resources were tested again as this force moved into Gaul. To make matters worse, much of the Roman army stationed in Britain would revolt following this invasion, moving under their usurper leader Constantine III to confront Honorius on the continent. Back in Italy, and King Alaric was soon to emerge once again, a sure sign if any were needed that Stilicho made an error not destroying his forces when he had the opportunity. From around 408 AD, Alaric's forces essentially besieged Rome. Hungry for loot and other material, they managed to extract a series of large ransoms from the city, including 5,000 pounds of gold and 30,000 pounds of silver. Legions were sent from the Eastern Empire, but were brutally ambushed and almost destroyed en route, failing to fulfill their mission. Without relief, and under unrelenting pressure from Gothic forces, a starving Rome opened her gates to Alaric's troops. On the 24th of August, 410 AD, they entered the city. The following sack was reportedly mild in terms of damage, but the mental blow was devastating. Rome was no longer the administrative capital of the empire, itself partly the result of barbarian threats, but to see it occupied and looted by barbarian forces was no less shocking. Here was the centuries-old, historic heart of power overtaken by enemy forces. The mighty empire could no longer adequately protect itself, and its future seemed to be hanging by a thread.